Welcome to the 2023 Words, Ideas, and Thinkers Festival. We are really excited to have everybody here. And I would like to first make sure everybody's phones are turned off so that we don't have that kind of an interruption. My name is John Costin. I am here, it's a great honor to be here. I am a veteran journalist, a lifelong journalist. Currently came out of retirement to continue to be a journalist, and I'm working at the Lakeville Journal in Lakeville, Connecticut, and the Millerton News in Millerton, New York. So I have a longer career at the Wall Street Journal in New York and retired from that publication a couple of times as well. So I can't seem to retire, and I think there's an old penny about fishermen, but it seems to be coming around on my case. We are here for a conversation with two really brilliant writers about Mrs. Dalloway at 98. And the conversation really will focus on changing the narrative. As a journalist, those words are really terrifying to me because people are not supposed to change the narrative, but it's been going on all over the country. Before jumping into any conclusion about what this conversation will be like today, I want to make sure that it's really clear I do not have the answers. The takeaway from today's conversation will be from these two speakers and writers. And so I just want to make sure that, for me, it's very humbling to even be here in the company of such intellectual writers. I think this conversation certainly, however, will address issues that we're all familiar with. Life's balance, how to balance our aspirations and our realities. The search for meaning, which is certainly something that spans everyone's lifetime. The bigger, deeper issue of yearning, and that, again, I have no answers, but I know about this, just as everyone does. And I think I was going to say quickly, we're very fortunate to have these two brilliant writers here today. As you all have received an email, you realize that we are changing the format a little bit. And Michael has COVID and could not be here, so we have recorded this conversation, and Roxana Robinson is here. There she is. She will indulge in a Q&A afterwards, so that will be helpful. I just want to say the last thing here is that we're going to learn for ourselves, I think, not from me, what it is like to be Mrs. Dalloway at 98. I want to thank our sponsors, the Cromwell Harbor Foundation, Hunter K. Renette and Mark P. Vandenbosch, Joanne Leonhardt Casillo, Taryn and Mark Levitt, Hans and Kate Morris, Diana Rowan Rockefeller, Amy Davidson Sorkin and David Sorkin, the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation, Mehrdad and Marilee Noorani, the October Mountain Financial Advisors, and Louise Hartwell White. I think at this point I will just give you a brief, you have already received, but a brief repeat of Roxana and Michael's bios. Roxana is the author of 10 books and 6 novels, 3 collections of short stories, and the biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. 4 of those were chosen as New York Times notable books, 2 as New York Times Editor's Choices. Her fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's, Best American Short Stories, Tin House, and elsewhere, including the Lakeville Journal. Sorry, Roxana, I had to work that in. She's been widely anthologized and broadcast on NPR. She's the recipient of many awards, the most recent being the Barnes & Noble Writers for Writers Award from Poets and Writers. She teaches an MFA program at Hunter College. Michael Cunningham, his novels include Home at the End of the World, Flesh and Blood, Specimen Days, By Nightfall, and The Snow Queen, as well as a collection, A Wild Swan and Other Tales, and the nonfiction book Land's End, I Walk in Provincetown. He's the recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts grant, Whiting Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship, and his work has appeared in The New Yorker and the Best American Short Stories. The Hours was a New York Times bestseller and the winner of both the PEN/Faulkner Award and the Pulitzer Prize. He was raised in Los Angeles, and he lives in New York City, and he's a professor of practice at Yale University. We're really sorry. We wish him a quick recovery from COVID. With that, I think we are about ready to begin watching, and I think we'll make sure we've got our phones turned off, and I think with that, we're going to just go right into it. Are you all set? By the way, I just want to show you one thing that proves a reporter's notebook. You know. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here. Thank you for coming to the WIT Festival put on by the Authors Guild. And thank you, Michael Cunningham, for joining us in this fashion. We're so disappointed that you have COVID, but we are so grateful that you can appear in this fashion on Zoom. And we're going to talk about your wonderful book, The Hours, in terms of our theme this year, which is changing the narrative. And your book itself changed one narrative, and it as a narrative has been changed several times. So you're a perfect subject for this. And welcome, and thank you for offering yourself and your book as our topic. So The Hours was a book that was really important to me, and I used it actually as a sort of a stepping stone when I was writing one of my books, and I would read from it every morning before I started writing. And somebody, a Virginia Woolf scholar, noticed this. She didn't know it was your book, but she wrote a review saying that I was channeling Virginia Woolf. I was actually channeling Michael Cunningham, but it came out as a voice that had been informed by Virginia Woolf. So know that your presence is exists in literature far beyond just your own books. So I want to talk about how you came to write The Hours first, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. And I think that as a male writer, you were incredibly brave at taking on something that women writers and readers and scholars may feel very, very proprietary about. Virginia Woolf is a territory that is fiercely guarded by women. And I think you were extremely courageous in choosing to use her story for your own ends. And I want to ask you if that felt dangerous to you, or what did you think?
Yeah, just quickly, I would so much rather be there in person. I can't believe that I got it just now. I'm glad to see everyone here, although I can't see you. I can feel you. Yeah, and thank you to Zoom for allowing this to happen, albeit in a slightly compromised way. Yes, I was terrified of a man. I am undeniably a man, writing not only about women, but writing about a feminist icon, not to mention the fact that if you stand too close to a titan of literature like Virginia Woolf, you're likely to look even smaller than you are. And I suppose we might substitute for the word courageous the word reckless, because I finally decided that as a writer, if you're going to go down, you might as well go down in big blue green flames. And so with appropriate trepidations, I went ahead. And don't let me go on too long about this, but to my real surprise, for the most part, wolf scholars were certainly not censorious about it. I didn't experience the kind of uproar that I had expected, including having been asked to give the keynote speech at a meeting of the Virginia Wolf Society. People were lovely. I had not been informed that the night before the keynote was a Virginia Woolf inspired costume party. I had not bought a Virginia Woolf inspired costume, and I'm not quite sure what that would have been. But I'm at the party, and someone came up to me, and she had strung her body and arms with blue crepe paper, to which she had attached rubber fish and shells, and she held out her arm, the crepe paper is dangling down, and she said, "What do you think I am?" And I said, "You got me." She said, "I am the waves." And I just thought, any force in the universe that has brought me into contact with these people, I'm totally grateful for that.
Oh, that's very good. Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, you ran the risk of being accused of cultural appropriation, and I think you did brilliantly. I mean, one reason maybe that people loved your book instead of criticizing it was that you took her so seriously, and you took her story so seriously, and you didn't really mess with it. You did create something else. So you were so respectful of her, and so respectful of her emotional story. And also, to be honest, your writing is so beautiful, and it really lives up to the standard, I think, that Woolf's writing established. And I remember when I read your book, when I came to her letter, which is embedded in your text, I felt the back of my neck tingle, because you had done the unthinkable. You had put your words next to hers and asked us, in effect, to judge your text, your writing. And I could not see the margin between them. And I thought, this is an amazing feat. This is an extraordinary thing. So you did it in a way that was very respectful to Woolf, but you also did it in a way that was kind of dazzling as a piece of writing. And so I'm glad that the scholars are respectful of you. So I also want to talk about the form, because your form is very interesting in this book. And because you write about Woolf, everybody who thinks of Virginia Woolf is aware of her suicide. That is kind of a dark aura around her and her work. So, but as a biographer or as a novelist, you don't tend to end with the death. But you started with the death. I mean, you don't tend to start with the death, but you started with the death. Can you talk about the form and how you came to that decision?
Absolutely. For anyone who might not have read it, there's a prologue in which Virginia Woolf ends her life, and then there are sort of three interconnected stories involving Virginia Woolf and two other women. Yeah, in an earlier draft, we ended with her suicide. That being technically the end of things. But then I got to thinking about how, Woolf suffered plunges into darkness for which the word depression feels a little mild. You can't really psychoanalyze anyone posthumously, but she went way, way, way down. Melancholia was nothing. She was it got very bad. And then she would sort of come back and get back to work. And she herself said that although she hated those dark periods, she also felt like they were part of her vision, that they contributed in their way, as awful as they were, to what she was able to write when she was doing better. And what I kept thinking was this. It's hard to imagine anyone better acquainted with just how bad it can be, just how low you can go, how bleak and hopeless everything can seem. And yet it would, at the same time, be hard to name another writer who has written so beautifully and directly and persuasively about the simple joy of being alive on a Tuesday in London. And I thought, for one thing, anyone who has fallen that low and can still insist on the marvels of being alive, that's an optimism we can trust. And also, Roxana, as you said, I mean, there are some writers like Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath, who are almost as widely known for their suicides as they are for their work. So I thought, you know what? Let's get Virginia Woolf's suicide out of the way. Let's establish that, yes, it happened, but it's not the most important thing about her. And let's just sort of, yep, that happened. And then move on from there and the book with life going on.
It's kind of brilliant. You're right. Yeah, everyone knows it. And so let's cut to the chase and go beyond it. It's a very beautiful passage. And I remember you saying somewhere that when people went to Monk's house, the house that Virginia Woolf lived in before this happened, which is in Sussex, that people, where I have visited, of course, as a Woolf worshiper, that people ask the docents where the path is because they want to go down to the river. I did not do that just because I was too, I didn't want to admit that that's what I wanted to do. So I didn't do it, but I wish I had, and you do it very powerfully and create that walk through the downs down to the river in a way that makes it indelible for the rest of us. So we feel as if we have experienced that last walk that Virginia Woolf took. So that's how you came to open the book with that image. Can I also ask you, because I've heard you say that when you and I had a conversation about this recently, we were talking about our favorite books, and you mentioned that you think To the Lighthouse is one of yours. So if that's one of your favorite books, how did you happen to choose this book instead of To the Lighthouse to use as your sort of the form that you were going to transform yourself?
absolutely. Mrs. Dalloway is Wolfe's fourth novel. To the Lighthouse is her fifth. Her first two novels are better than most novels, but they're relatively conventional. And if that was her entire output, I don't know if we would be reading her the way we are now. But, you know, she was, when she wrote those books, her editor at Duckworth and Company, one George Duckworth, was her half brother who had been molesting her and her sister Virginia since they were adolescents. So she's submitting manuscripts to the man who molested her when she was young. Not a good relationship. And I suspect that with those first two books, people write novels for so many reasons, but I suspect somewhere in her mind was the idea that, you know, why would you be published by that guy of all the publishers? And I sort of imagine that this is going to get into that in her letters, that she wanted to show him that he had not done so much damage as to render her incapable of writing a traditional novel with vivid characters and a beginning and a middle and an end. But then after those first two books, she and her husband Leonard moved to Richmond, which was outside of London. At the time, it was a slightly remote suburb. It's a little more incorporated with the urban mass by now, and started the Hogarth Press in their basement. And suddenly, Virginia could write whatever she wanted. And her first book from there was Jacob's Room, which is remarkable. But then her second book was Mrs. Dalloway, which is sort of beyond remarkable. And one of the reasons, well, Mrs. Dalloway I had read when I was much younger, so there's a certain sense of like a first kiss or whatever. But one of the things that is so remarkable about Mrs. Dalloway is that as you read it, you can almost see Virginia Woolf figuring out how to write a great novel by writing one. And it has a slightly riffish quality. It has some loose ends. No slight to its revolutionary aspects, but you can feel her feeling her way. And then from there, she goes to the Lighthouse in an early letter to Vanessa. Before she started writing to the Lighthouse, she drew it. It's an hourglass on its side, two triangles and a middle. And then she wrote exactly that. Open section, time passes, closing section. It started out geometrically. And to whatever extent there was a conscious decision on my part, it's one of the things you kind of realize in retrospect. I felt like, how to put this? I could sort of cling to the more faceted edges of Mrs. Dalloway than I could to the kind of perfect surfaces of the Lighthouse. If Mrs. Dalloway had a certain brilliant riff-ish quality, I kind of felt, well, then I could do another riff on that.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. I agree with you. I think To the Lighthouse is one of the great novels, and I don't think novels really, as a form, are perfect. They're short stories can be perfect, but novels just are by their nature imperfect, but that novel is pretty close to perfect. It's really hard to find a fissure in it.
Yeah.
So the voice in this book, which is poetic and trance-like and very beautiful and very similar to Woolf's. I want to know, as a writer, how you found your way to that voice. It's hard to find the voice of a book. How did you do it?
It's always hard to find the voice for a book, and a little extra hard when you're doing it in the light and shadow of someone like Virginia Woolf. What I did was I read everything, and there's a lot. There are many books and short stories, and between her diaries and her letters, where you see her speaking more extemporaneously, we can account for almost every day of her life. And so I read all of it, and then put all the books in a collected letters and diaries away, and did not let myself look at them again, and started writing, so that I would ideally be sort of writing heavily under the influence of Virginia Woolf without actually trying to mimic her.
Interesting.
I've learned so much from her, not least of which is the use of the semicolon and the parenthetical. She was the Mozart of punctuation.
She definitely was. And the way she uses parentheses is unparalleled. No one uses them like her. Okay, so, and you used that actual letter, and then in the end notes, you say that you got permission from the estate. Is that correct, to use it? And did they ask you anything? Did they put any kind of qualification on it, or did they just say yes, use it however you like?
They just said yes. The letter that she left for Leonard, she also left one for Vanessa, but it hasn't survived. There's a couple lines from it that somebody wrote down. But if I was already in love with Virginia Woolf just from reading her prose, I was that much more in love with her when I read her last letter to Leonard, which is essentially, on her part, an act of benediction and forgiveness. What she is basically saying in that letter is, don't blame yourself. You didn't do anything wrong. If anything, you kept me going this long. And I just thought an act of generosity like that, as really one of your last living acts, is remarkable and heroic and gorgeous.
Yeah, it is. It is. I like the way you describe it. And I'm glad you put it in there so that we understand those things about her character, as you say, generosity and an absence of blame, an absence of judgment, kindness, really. One of the things that I find interesting in your book is the way you invert the story of the returning veteran. So that in Mrs. Dalloway, the book, although it is about a society matron based on a woman called Kitty Maxey, whom we know about, Virginia Woolf makes it a much larger story and incorporates another. So in some ways, her book prefigures yours, because there are two different narratives, one of Mrs. Dalloway and one of Septimus Smith, who is unrelated to Mrs. Dalloway except in terms of Virginia Woolf's mind. But Septimus Smith has returned from World War One and with a terrible internal wounds, I mean, psychological wounds, which we would now call PTSD and then called shell shock. So that presence, the presence of the war that's just been ended, is very powerful in Mrs. Dalloway, and you make it very powerful in The Hours, although you invert that. And so in your book, the returning veteran seems completely undamaged by the war. I think that's not likely, but that's the way he presents himself. And in fact, it's the wife, and in Mrs. Dalloway, Septimus Smith is English and his wife is foreign. His wife is Italian. And you invert that in The Hours and make the wife a woman who feels herself as foreign, and the husband is the American. But he has no trauma, and it's the wife who has the trauma. Do you want to talk about that, how you came to that decision, which I think is also quite brilliant?
Sure, sure. This is the section of the book that deals with a sort of homemaker in the 50s who is reading Mrs. Dalloway and finding real company and consolation in it, because she is desperately unhappy. She thinks about taking her own life. Spoiler alert, she doesn't. But it's in her mind, and there's the idea out of which that relationship she and her husband sprung. Idea is not, you don't have an idea about a character. You have a feel for a character, and you sort of have a sense of, certainly within a relationship, how they came together. And her husband, Dan, has not only just come back from the war, but has come back, and he was, before the war, and still is after the war, the king of the prom, the captain of the football team, that guy. And instead of marrying the prom queen and the cheerleader, he marries Laura, a bookish girl who, when they knew each other in high school, was, not spectacular, not sought after. And I think here is what I think of as the sort of reverse in that relationship, is that to Dan, he's not thinking this, but essentially he is the prince who kisses Snow White, the prince who actually kisses. There's a lot of kissing and resuscitation in fairy tales.
Magical kissing.
Yeah. I've always wondered about Snow White. So, like, he just finds a corpse in the woods and kisses it. What's that about? But that's another topic for another time. And takes her off to live in the castle, which is certainly in the Disney versions, which I grew up with, a kind of glittering silhouette on the horizon that they're riding toward. And even when I was a kid, I thought, well, is she going to be happy in the castle? I haven't even been there. How's that going to work for her? And so what sort of happens in this relationship in my book is Dan, with every good intention, has sort of taken not the pretty sister, but more like the homely stepsister, and said, you know what, you're going to the castle, which is all well and good, except she doesn't belong there. And he has taken her to a life that's wrong for her. She's not a happy homemaker. She would she would rather read than vacuum and make dinner. And so what seemed like a good idea in theory does not play out so well over time.
And how did you find Laura? How did you find that housewife?
You know, my parents are both gone now, and I feel a little freer to talk about this than I did. She is loosely based on my mother. Um, and I was so naive as to imagine that my mother would be pleased to see someone who resembled her taken seriously enough to be a character in a novel. What was I thinking? Um, of course, she was upset about
Mm,
it and betrayed. But here's the thing. They made a movie, and then years later they made an opera out of it, and they were filming the movie. As they were filming the movie, my mother was diagnosed with cancer, which ran through her pretty quickly. And as they were still filming the movie, I called the producer and said, I have a terrible feeling that my mother may not actually get to see the finished movie. Is there anything you can do? And this is Los Angeles. This is back in the house I grew up in. They messengered over like 20 minutes of dailies. And so I found myself sitting on the sofa we'd had for as long as I could remember with my mother, who, as it turned out, would die in about another 3 weeks, watching Julianne Moore play her as if she were already being reincarnated. And I think the element of disconnect, not to mention Julianne Moore, the whole thing made more sense to my mother. And I think she felt more of the aspect of tribute and less the aspect of, you little rat, I raised you and then you made me look like this in your novel. If you want to
that
make if you want to make it up to your parents, always try to find a really fabulous movie star to play them.
note to self. Yeah, thank you.
Keep that in mind.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's good. Um, yeah, I mean, I think nobody likes being written about, actually, as it turns out.
People think they're going to like it, and then they
Yeah,
don't.
yeah. So you were brave to do it. You were not the first person to choose your family to write about, but it's risky and dangerous. But I'm so glad that your mother could reach the place at which she saw that this was a tribute to her. It's a very beautiful portrait and very moving, I think. And I also love that little boy in the movie.
Oh boy,
Oh
yes.
my gosh. Did he strike you as you? Did you look at him and say, that's how I felt?
No, the Richard, the son, is not as much me as a little boy as Laura, the mother, is my mother.
Mhm.
There are overlaps, but that one's much less sort of autobiographical. Here's a funny thing about, his name is Jack in the movie. He was 6 years old. He had never acted before. They talked to a lot of little boys, and so thrilled with Jack's natural abilities. But until Jack showed up with his mother on the set, with his father on the set, which no one had been told that his mother had died about 6 months earlier.
Oh my gosh.
6? He's not as
Oh
bad.
my gosh.
He is introduced to Julia Moore, who's going to be his mother now. He didn't go for that. He didn't want any part of that. And the first day of the scenes with Julianne and Jack, she thought, okay, we're going to work with this. We're going to work with the fact that you hate me. But he hated her too much. And so it's kind of amazing, with the exception of one scene that he got him to sit through towards the end. They filmed all of her takes separately from his takes.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. It is this is the magic of the movies. And they edited them together so it looks like they're in the same place at the same time, and they're not.
So what was he thinking? I mean, he looks at someone as though he adores her. So he was just a genius actor, and he was making up someone in his mind that he was
He's
looking at.
looking at the director, Stephen Daldry, who is very good with kids.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's astonishing.
Yeah. Those loving looks on Jack's face are actually directed not at Julianne Moore, but at a gay English film director.
It's amazing because his presence in the movie is what makes her defection so terrible. Is his desperation when she crosses the room and walks out of the room, let alone walking out of his life. So that's an amazing piece of information. Thank you. Okay, so this is a lot of good information about the book itself, which changes the narrative from Mrs. Dalloway to the Hours. So we're segueing into the movie. I think the movie is brilliant. There are very few movies in my estimation that match a great book. It's very unusual to have a movie that's as good as a book. But in my estimation, this movie is brilliant. So, did you have anything to say about the screenplay? Were you a consultant? Did you help in any way? What was your role?
They were very generous. The screenplay adaptation was written by David Hare, amazing English playwright. And when your book is optioned for a movie, it's a little bit like selling your house. You've sold it. It's not yours anymore, and they are under no obligation to talk to you at all. But David and Stephen Daldry, the director, we're still friends. Were very generous about talking to me about, do you have any ideas about this? Do you have ideas about that? And I did, and some of them they took, some of them they didn't take. But it turned out that one of maybe my most essential function was my ability as the writer of the novel to say every now and then to David Hare, you don't need to, don't be faithful here. I urge you to veer away from the original text. There's nothing holy about it. I would much rather see your version of the story than some slightly creepily faithful version of the movie. We only had one disagreement, which was when Laura Brown, played by Julianne Moore, is going to this hotel thinking maybe she might or might not end her life there. In the sort of penultimate draft, she goes up to the garage and reaches onto a shelf and gets a gun and puts it into her bag. And I said, David, these people wouldn't have a gun. But say they do, she wouldn't do that to us. She wouldn't want to be found that way. And David said, well, I know there's a kind of trope about how men blow their brains out and women take too many pills, and I want to sort of upset that stereotype. But as I listened to him, I just kept thinking, David Hare, English person, you just think all Americans are packing, don't you?
Or what? Oh, packing,
Packing, yeah, packing weapons.
packing heat.
I bet you think if this conversation was on much longer, I'm going to take out my gun and shoot you. Um, it felt so wrong. And really it was my only sort of like put my foot down moment, but it felt really wrong. And I talked to Stephen Daldry about it. Stephen Daldry, also an English person, said, no, a gun is much more dramatic. I think we should do the gun. And so I called Julianne Moore and said, because I knew her slightly and already. And I said, what do you think about the gun? And she said, I hate it. I was going to try to make it work, but now that I know that you don't like it either, I'm going to say I can't play this, which is something, if you're a serious enough actor, you can occasionally do. You can say, I just cannot make this convincing. So, well, here are two takeaways, both involving Julianne Moore. Try to get her to play your mother if you possibly can. If you're losing an argument, just call a movie star.
That's a great story, and I totally agree with her. It's unthinkable that woman would have picked up a pistol and put it in her pocketbook.
In fairness to the English people who thought we all just had guns with us all the time in America, the fact that the movie turned out to be a big hit was a surprise to everyone. People were excited about it, but I don't know if anybody imagined the kind of reception it was going to have. And so there was a certain understandable tendency to buoy it up, to keep it from being too, I don't want to say sleepy, but you know what I mean, too muted. Yeah, give her a gun. There's that. I mean, things, movies, novels, anything that proves to be successful was not created with that in mind. I mean,
No,
well,
it was
the
true to the
Marvel
book.
movies, though there's a whole and certain bestsellers, yes, but most of the rest of it, you have no idea. And you sort of do the best you can, thinking, nobody's going to want to see this.
Well, it's a great cast and it's a great screenplay and it's a great piece of writing. It's a great book. So I'm shifting my little Zoom camera here a bit. So I'm glad you stepped in about the gun. That would have really changed the nature of the book. And made it very wrong for me. So were there surprises that about the movie, that things you didn't expect to happen or to be part of it?
Not exactly that, but what was really interesting about the movie was seeing things that actors can do that you couldn't really write. Not that they're beyond the power of language, but it would feel a little too self-conscious if you were. There's a moment in the scene between Meryl Streep and Jeff Daniels when they're talking about the love of both their lives, this man who has AIDS, when she loses her balance just for a second. And it's just an actor thing.
Mm-hmm.
A little late at another point in the movie, in one of the scenes with Virginia Woolf, played brilliantly by Nicole Kidman, her sister Vanessa, played by Miranda Richardson, has come to visit, and they have had Virginia has been a little strange with the children. And Vanessa is sort of cheerfully, but with a certain haste, getting her kids the hell out of there.
You think she was
And
strange just because she did the funeral with the bird? You think that was strange?
no, there's I wish I could, she says something kind of inappropriate to the little girl. Little girl, do you know what happens when you die? No, it's like that. Not quite. I can't quote it exactly, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's she's not really good with children.
Mhm.
And the what the screenplay says that Nicole, aka Virginia, kisses Miranda, aka Vanessa, goodbye, and what Nicole did, to everyone's surprise, was grab Miranda and plant this full on her lips vampire kiss, as if she is trying to suck the essence out of Vanessa. And Miranda sort of stumbled back and would not do another take, but fortunately they got that take. So there's things like that, you know, that are
Interesting.
just the other life of a movie. And it's why, although many movies based on books are disappointing, it is not a lesser art form. It's just a different art form.
Yeah. Your book is so interior as Virginia Woolf's writing is that it was sort of hard for me to imagine how that interior, that very rich, slow interior narrative would translate into a movie. But I think that it does quite brilliantly. Okay, so the opera. This is the third or fourth, depending on how you're counting, iteration of this story. And what did you think of that? How were you involved? What was your first thought when somebody said, let's make an opera out of this book? And were you involved? And tell us what you thought about it.
Um, that time I was not involved at all. Um, the composer and the lyricist wanted to be entirely free of me and reimagine it on their own, which is fine with me.
Mhm.
It's whatever works. So no, it was optioned a few years before it went up, and then I went to the opening along with everybody else. Uh, and I think they did a beautiful job. I mean, there is at the very end of the opera a sort of trio with the three amazing divas, Renee Fleming and Joyce Donato and Kelly O'Hara, that already feels sort of historical.
Yeah.
And it was the strangest thing to be at the Metropolitan Opera. It sold out. They're gonna do it again this year with the same cast.
Oh,
Um,
great.
which was remarkable and a little strange. And they didn't use a lot of the dialogue of the language from the novel. They kind of did their own. That they felt a certain sense of ownership, but there were some lines, and I can't remember which line it was, but there was something that years and years earlier I could remember having written and thinking, oh, this will do for now, and I'll make it better later, and then never did. And then years pass, and I'm hearing Renee Fleming sing that line from the stage at the Met. So, you never know what's going to happen.
And did you have any interaction with the singers before or after? Did you
Yes,
talk about it? Yeah.
there was a dinner, and I got to hang out with all of them. and we went out together after one of the performances. No, they were lovely. I don't know what am I trying to say? There was nothing of the quote unquote diva about them.
Mhm.
And we were just having dinner. It was just fun.
Did they talk about interpreting those roles? Was it difficult for them? Did they know the characters before they, if you're a Virginia Woolf fan, of course you would know those characters, but perhaps they weren't Virginia Woolf fans or hadn't read your book. So what was their journey to the roles?
We didn't talk too much about that, except Kelly O'Hara, who did this remarkable job playing Laura Brown, wanted to talk. We did it mostly by email about Laura Brown and who she was and what's her story, because I didn't know this. When you are rehearsing an opera, it's almost entirely about the music and hardly at all about the character. It's just sort of not a concern
Mhm.
in opera world. So yeah, Kelly and I talked at some length about Laura Brown, and neither Joyce nor Renee needed to. I mean, one of the things that has been so fascinating about these various incarnations is seeing how different actors or actors who are also singers work. Back to the movie for a moment. Nicole wanted to be very specifically directed. Um, I think partly because she was almost as nervous about playing Virginia Woolf as I was about writing Virginia Woolf. Whereas you like with Meryl Streep, you just let her do what she does. She kind of says, I don't get directed. And well, you couldn't possibly devote too much time and space to Julianne Moore. Julianne is especially interesting in that she doesn't really know where this amazing ability of hers comes from. So she's a little superstitious about it. And Julianne doesn't want to talk about the character at all because she's afraid if she looks too closely at what she's doing, she won't be able to do it.
Mhm.
So there you have it. The process works differently for everybody who does almost anything creative.
Yeah, lots of writers feel that way, that they don't want to talk about the process because you don't know how it works yourself, and you're afraid you'll jinx it if you analyze it. That's the risk.
Right. Or in my case, you're afraid you will lose your faith in it if you talk about it too much, and it just sounds sort of silly, because certainly most novels reduce to like a whale bit off his leg. He's really mad. He can't get over it. Don't bother to write Moby Dick. It's kind of silly, really.
I know. It's a bunch of guys in a boat.
Bunch of guys in a boat. Yeah. Yeah. So for many of us, it's better not to subject ourselves to that kind of oversimplification.
Certainly not while you're in the process.
Right.
You can
Afterwards,
look back at it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But only once it has some kind of life of its own.
So is there anything I have not raised that you want to talk about? So one more question. So The Hours it was written in response to another book. It's been written as a book. It's been created as a movie and created as an opera. When you think of that work, that narrative now that you created, does it appear to you as discrete as your own book, or do you think of it now with these accretions surrounding it? Is it something larger that's been added onto so that the whole is something different, larger than the one you made? How does it feel in your consciousness?
That's a really good question. I don't feel deeply connected to the adaptations as much as I love them. Like I was saying, it's somebody else's version of the story,
Hmm.
and I've been fortunate in it having been given into the hands of really gifted people. Um, the Hours, the novel is one of six I've written, with a seventh about to come out, and I feel perfectly fine about the Hours. It doesn't feel to me like my primary book, and the others were either build-ups to it or sort of backslides down from it. But whenever I feel even slightly tempted, when somebody is talking to me about the Hours, whenever I feel even slightly tempted, yeah, I wrote some other books too. I
So,
just
I mean, yeah, go
well, I
ahead.
slap myself and say silently to myself, how many books are people still talking about 25 years afterwards? How many books get turned into movies and operas? So shut up and be really great.
Of course, you've written other wonderful books, and I understand that feeling. Of course, you don't want to be um, approached as though that's the only book you wrote. It's not. It's just that given this festival and given that our theme, your book was perfect to discuss. And I but this is a perfect segue. Do you want to tell us about the new book that you have that's coming out, what, next month or 2 months from now?
No, middle of November.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. Like so many fiction writers, when I started it a couple of years ago, was confronted with the question of the pandemic. On one hand, you can't write a contemporary, I can't imagine writing a contemporary novel as if that wasn't happening, because it was happening to every single person on the planet. There's nothing local about it. On the other hand, how do you not write what I would just call a pandemic novel? How do you not write about a catastrophe of such enormity that it reduces the characters to tiny figures in a huge landscape? And what I came up with, the novel's called Day. I don't know. So anyway, Day, Day, Day. Three little letters. The next one's going to be two letters. Um, it's a single day in April involving a body of characters. But morning takes place in 2019 before the pandemic. Afternoon takes place in 2020 during the pandemic, and evening takes place. We're not in after the pandemic, but when we're no longer afraid that we'll get it from the mail, and we're not wearing masks, like many of us. And that's the book. And as is always the case, you have no idea how it will be received. It's not, I guess what was important to me in writing it was not only that the characters be more central than the pandemic, but that how to put this? It have gravitas, but isn't just a drag. Because we've all been traumatized by the pandemic, and we still tell jokes, and we still love the people we love, and so it is very much about coming out the other side of a catastrophic event, which we do not underestimate and which not everyone survives, but not unlike the hours. I think this is probably true of all my novels, as far as I can tell. It's always about life going on, and what obdurately survives, even in the face of some of the worst things that could possibly happen. Thank you for asking.
That's kind of a great note to end this on.
Yeah.
Life going on despite everything.
Mm-hmm.
And going on in a way that reminds us of beauty.
Yeah.
Which is really important in your work, and it's very important in Virginia Woolf's work. And I think it's one of the things that we're encouraged to believe makes life worth living is the beauty that surrounds us, and the beauty that we can find in the world and from other people. It's very much a part of The Hours, and it's the book, and it's very much a part of Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. That sense of love and gratitude for the world and gratitude for the best parts of our lives is preeminent.
Yeah. And for me also, sort of understanding that some of the best parts of our lives are not necessarily the easiest parts of our lives. That whenever the end comes, that I hope, I imagine, fondly remember some of the difficult parts that were not picnics or scenic vistas. Not that I have anything against picnics and scenic vistas, but I just kind of feel like one of the many things I love about Virginia Woolf is her insistence on the beauty of the ordinary.
Yeah, she does that.
Yeah. There are the flowers that Clarissa goes to get, but there are just a million little details about London and life. There's an airplane going overhead that turns out to be spelling out not a prophetic message, but an ad for some kind of toffee. So I mean, yeah, enough said. But I think one of her less heralded contributions was her insistence on sort of the rampancy of beauty, even where it's not supposed to reside.
There's a wonderful scene in, I'm sure you've read it, in John Lehman's book, Moments of Being.
Yeah.
Is that the title, or is that one of her books? Anyway, he worked at the Hogarth Press. You know that. I'm just explaining for the audience. And he described during the Blitz, being in London on the street one night during an air raid, and Virginia Woolf was on the street, and he recognized her from behind, and everybody else was running for cover because there were bombs coming overhead, and Virginia Woolf stood still, transfixed, and watched these explosions taking place in the sky. And it was different for her. She was looking at this as a phenomenon of extraordinary beauty instead of terror that made everybody else run for the basement. So she had that capacity.
We could use that as a working definition of genius. The person who stands in the middle of the street because they want to see the explosions happening. Yeah. Have it.
All right. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. So thank you so much, Michael, for being here in this alternate form.
Yes.
And I wish you were here in person. And
thank you, everybody, all I can't see you, but thank you all for coming. And thank you, Roxana. That was great.
Well, it was a treat for me to be able to talk to you about these subjects, which are dear to my heart. So thank you, Michael, and thank you, the Authors Guild, for putting on the Wit Festival. And I hope my paths will cross with all of you, and particularly you, Michael, soon. So thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. So I'm sorry I'm not Michael, but I will be glad to answer any questions as to the best of my ability. You can tell how much I enjoyed talking to Michael, and we tried to make it as accessible as possible. It took place right yesterday. I was here in Lenox, or here in Pittsfield, so it's as close to being here as we could possibly make it. And these are topics Michael and I have talked about before, so I feel as if I know a lot about what he thinks about these subjects, and if there's anything I can answer for you, if you have any questions for me, I'd be glad to answer them. Yeah. Somebody in the back? Yeah.
You're a biographer as well. I love your Georgia O'Keeffe. When you're working with a person who's entered into rest already, are you trying to capture their essence, or are you really trying to do hard biography along with Michael?
Do you mean when I wrote the biography of O'Keeffe, was I trying to capture her essence?
Yes, and do you think, Michael, the same with Virginia Woolf? Are you going for something that's very hard or more philosophical? Does that make any sense whatsoever?
So it's a good question. I was fascinated by Michael's decision to read everything Woolf had written and then put it away, and I understand that approach. When I wrote about O'Keeffe was an extraordinary letter writer. There are thousands of letters that exist in the Stieglitz Circle at the Beinecke Library, and she was a wonderful descriptive writer. So I could enter very closely into her life and learn how she felt about the people around her and about the landscape. She was a wonderful describer of the landscape, and you could feel very deeply and very closely how she looked at the landscape. So, for example, like Virginia Woolf standing in the street during the Blitz, Georgia O'Keeffe wrote a letter when she was in Texas in 1915, and she lived in a boarding house outside of town, not where none of the other teachers were, so she could be sort of separate from, she was teaching, separate from her own community. And she describes going outside one night and watching a lightning storm so that she just could see the entire sky lit up by this extraordinary illuminating presence. And it's very much like Virginia Woolf. So that was very important to me, to enter into her sensibility and her consciousness, to know what the things were that struck her when she met people or when she walked into a landscape. So I was trying to present her consciousness, her state of mind in the book. Yeah. Okay, so that's, the question was, I made a statement during this about the forms of the short story and the novel and comparing them. When I teach creative writing, I talk about the difference between the short story and the novel. A short story can be perfect. There are lots of short stories that I would say are perfect, and I'm sure you know stories that you think are perfect too. And I tell my students a short story is like a fish. It has a perfectly described form. It's a perfect arc. There is nothing extraneous on that form. There's nothing that isn't necessary. And each word overlaps the word behind it, and they form a smooth, continuous, glittering surface. That's how a short story works. A novel is a pair of overalls. You can stuff anything into it you want. You can put in a whole chapter about the whiteness of the whale. It has nothing to do with the narrative. It doesn't carry the action. It's just what Melville was thinking about. And novelists do that all the time. They stick stuff in that they've been thinking about or something that they saw that morning. And it makes a whole because it does, because it's just this big body of stuff that the novelist is putting in. And so there are very few novels, as I say, that I would think are perfect. They're mostly not perfect, which is fine. It's just a different form. It's bigger and more capacious. Yeah. Yeah?
This is terrific. There's a conspicuous absence in the discussion that I'm wondering about, and that's the absence of discussion about the AIDS crisis. Now, Richard always seems to be selfless, and it's embodied in him. And the entire story takes place below 14th Street, where the battle was raging. So I'm wondering why this wasn't discussed. Because this book is one of the great novels written during the period, and he actually wrote about some of this stuff.
Okay, this question was, why did our discussion not touch on the fact that Richard, the main character in one of the three narrative strains in the Hours, he's a poet who's dying of AIDS, and we didn't mention that at all. It's a really good point. We didn't have time to talk about everything in the book, and that's, of course, it's a central subject in that strain of the narrative, and in a way that's another aspect of war. That was another war our country was fighting, and he is a wounded warrior. So it's another way of another strand of war damage. But as I say, we just didn't have time to talk about everything, and I didn't get to that. But it's a very good point to raise. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, did Michael Cunningham influence me to write about the pandemic? Well, since he only said that yesterday, I would have to be a very fast writer to get that into my work. Thank you for your kind words about the interview. He's a wonderful subject. So he and I have talked about books many times, so I knew it was going to be a treat, and it was. But I think every writer, every fiction writer, probably every nonfiction writer too, has this presence of the pandemic. It's the pandemic and 9/11 are both very difficult to write about. 9/11 really because if you were in it, you're dead. And if you survived, you were watching. You're just an observer. And it's very hard to find the way into that disaster. For the pandemic, as Michael said, and it's certainly something I have wrestled with, every person in the world experienced that at the same time. We were all in it. You can't tell somebody about your set of circumstances and astonish anyone because we were all there. We all heard the people leaning out the windows and clapping. We all heard the sirens. We were all terrified. We were not protected by our government. It was a terrifying time, but we were all in it at the same time. So it's hard to figure out, and I'm still trying to figure out if I can write about it or not. And I'm delighted to hear that Michael has found a way into it. But it's complicated. And most people choose their own private, intimate way into anything, a death like the story of the Hours, or sickness or pain, but it's private, it's intimate, it's yours, and this is everyone's. So it's very hard to make it intimate and private without feeling that everyone is watching you and saying that's not what it was like, it was different. So it's a complicated subject. And he hasn't influenced me yet. There was someone else, yeah.
I was wondering about the title Wolf at 98 and you being a wolf enthusiast as well. How do you think Virginia Woolf continues to change the narrative that's happening today?
So the question is, how is Woolf continuing to change the narrative today? Woolf is, for me and many, many women writers, an absolutely transformative presence in literature. She was extremely brave herself, and she wrote in a way, she was influenced by Proust, and she wrote in her diaries and in letters, I'm astonished by this. If only I could write like this. And she does. She clearly is struck by that sense of moving into consciousness, allowing consciousness to be the narrative, to be the plot. There is no plot. It's just consciousness. And that was a very radical thing for her to do. But so she's a radical writer. She committed suicide, so every woman alive has a sense of the risks of being a woman. Women's emotional lives are alternately derided and mocked or treated as strange, and every woman recognizes the risks of talking about an emotional life. Woolf found her emotional life to be something in the end she couldn't deal with, and every woman alive knows the possibility of that. Plus, she's an extraordinary giant in the literary world. There are a lot of writers women writers who are minor writers, and we all love them, but she stands up next to anyone. She's as great a writer as any man that existed. So, and she's also extraordinarily prolific. So I myself own the books of her diaries, and I read from it every morning at breakfast. And there's something like 13 volumes, so I will never finish it. I mean, when I finish, I'll start over. It doesn't matter. But she writes about everything. She is completely candid. Her writing is incredibly beautiful, so it's almost like poetry. You can read it as poetry. It's sort of blank verse. She is politically radical, stood up to the English patriarchy and said, "You sent your sons to college and you kept your daughters at home." She said that at a time when no one said it. She said, "If my father had lived, I could not have been a writer." She said these things out loud at a time and in a place where no one was saying them. So every woman writer thanks her for saying things we didn't know we needed to say. So what more do we want? She's what we have. She's what we needed. Oh, I'm getting the hook. Okay. Thank you all for coming.
I have a little story about this session. When I talked to Michael about coming, I said, "Who do you think we should have interview you?" And he said, "Well, let's try to get Renee and Meryl to come." And I said, "Who do you think I am?" He said, "Well, I know both of them, and Meryl has a place over in Lakeville, and Renee said, I would love to do this sometime, but I'm singing the opera that day." Meryl never took my call. But who would do better than Roxana Robinson? I don't know if Patrick or Isaac or Saeed or Daniel or Stacy or Marty is in, but they have to mention Moby Dick. It's just the thing. Lunch is being served outside. I think we have barbecue and salads and sandwiches from the concession stand. At 1 o'clock, Saeed Jones, poet, memoirist, extraordinary human being, and Isaac Fitzgerald, memoirist, children's book story, BFF, will be here. We will see you then. And what a great day we have for you. Thank you for all being here.